the North Shore to meet with some constituents. And when I walked in, the person hosting it told me that shock was through the room because they had just learned that day that their life fortunes, who had been handled by this Mr. Madoff, who I hadn't even heard of before, had been part of a Ponzi scheme. And of course, the next day the arrest was made, the story broke. So my first encounter with it, I could see the shock on people's faces. I could see the pall that was over the room. And since then, the situation has only gotten worse. I have a number of questions regarding what's happened over the course of the last year. Like Mr. Ackerman, you see a tragedy like this unfold, and then you see over the course of the next year the victims being victimized again. And I know there are no easy answers on this, but to me there's almost been an imputation of fraud to the victims themselves, somehow implying or imputing Madoff's offenses to them, that somehow they should have known, or somehow they are co-conspirators with Bernard Madoff. And yet there is no evidence to suggest that at all. So we have the redefinition of net equity. We have the clawback, which could be devastating. We have the fact that taxes have been paid over the years, for many years, on non-existent profits. We have the feeder fund issue where, including a former member of Congress called me, he never heard of Bernie Madoff. He lived as far from New York as anyone could, and it turns out that his life savings through a broker have been invested by Bernard Madoff, and he has lost everything. And then there's the whole issue of what appears to be almost unfettered power being given to the trustee to change definitions, decide who he's going to go after, why he's going to go after them, whether or not there's specific authority for him to do it or not. So these are all issues because, as the chairman said, and I believe the ranking member also said, this will not be the last Ponzi scheme. This will not be the last massive fraud. And I don't think enough attention, and all of us share responsibility for this, has been given over the years to what do you do when a massive fraud like this develops. And we have to address it, and in addressing it to the future, I think we also have to find ways to protect those who are currently the victims. So I look forward to the hearing. I look forward to working with all the members of the subcommittee and committee in trying to come up with legislation to address the real needs of the victims and also to do what we can to ensure that there is much better enforcement in the future and much stricter enforcement to make sure this does not happen again. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to the testimony. I thank the witnesses for being here today. I thank the victims who have taken the time here to be with us here today, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. King. And now we'll hear from the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Klein. 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing. And again, we'd also like to thank the witnesses and the victims who have come forward with their stories and with their rights to be made whole in different ways. Mr. Madoff's Ponzi scheme, which is thought to be the largest securities fraud in modern history, has defrauded thousands of people in my congressional district in South Florida, charities, lots of other people around the United States. This episode was not only embarrassment to the SEC as they allowed this massive fraud to continue for well over a decade despite repeated warnings, but time and time again the SEC, quote, investigated, close quote, Mr. Madoff and pronounced his business to be sound. And if you're an investor and you have an investment in a particular security, you would think that this would be a sound investment with the SEC stamping its regulatory approval. There have been lots of issues that have already been mentioned by Mr. King and others: clawback, taxes paid, how were we made whole from this terrible situation. And the fact that this has gone on for over a year is really something that's a moral outrage that hasn't been resolved in some successful way. Now, I think the most important thing we have to recognize as citizens and as members of Congress and as even people who are victims is we have rule of law in the United States. And we have a responsibility as members of Congress and as Americans to make sure the SIPC and the SEC are living up to their statutory responsibilities. Ensuring that the Madoff victims receive some protection from the government is important in restoring confidence in our entire investment system. Yet some investors, we know that were complicit, and they should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Yet others, and most others, were not. Many hardworking Americans have invested their life savings, and the SIPC symbol in the window has to mean something. The SEC repeatedly gave Madoff a clean bill of health. Investors relied on this analysis, and the SIPC symbol, as I said, has to mean something when you move forward and you make an investment in the United States system. To go after these investors who lost everything now violates most people's sense of fairness on a consistent level. How can they be held to a higher standard than professional analysts at the SEC? Irving Picard has determined that investors who have drawn more money out of the account than originally put in are not entitled to full SIPC coverage. And further, the trustee can claw back money from them. And again, I see an inconsistency in interpretation here which needs to be resolved. The purpose of the SIPC is to honor legitimate expectations of customers and instill confidence in our capital markets. And it's important to provide SIPC protection up to $500,000, not only for the victims of this fraud, but to ensure on a going forward basis that Americans can have confidence in the securities markets in the United States. I look forward to the testimony and a productive discussion and an appropriate conclusion. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Klein. And now I ask unanimous consent that Congressman Ellison be permitted to provide an opening statement. If there are no objections, Congressman Ellison is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me thank all the witnesses as well. I don't think I'll need 10 minutes, 2 minutes, excuse me. I simply want to say that the amount of disruption that this massive Ponzi scheme has caused Americans cannot be overestimated. In my own district of the 5th Congressional District of Minnesota, I've heard from people who thought they were in qualified ERISA plans who now learn that maybe things are not going to be as they expected because of definitions in the law. I've heard from people who run charities for charitable work who have been devastated by the impact of this lapse. And so I look forward to this hearing. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses. I want to thank the witnesses for all the work that they've done, and I want to thank members of the committee as well. And I also just want to say that I want to thank the work of Mr. Maffei. He and I have been working together on what may bring some relief to some people. And I want to, again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the ranking member for the hearing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ellison. Now it's up to the panel, and I want to thank the panel for appearing before the subcommittee today. And without objection, your written statements will be made part of the record. You will each be recognized for a 5-minute summary of your statement, and please contain your remarks to 5 minutes. I would now like to recognize Ms. Janine Langford, an investor in the Mott Family Investors and an indirect investor in Mr. Madoff's fund. Ms. Langford.
Chairman Kanjorski, Ranking Member Garrett, and members of the committee. Thank you for holding these hearings and looking into the SEC's complicity with Bernard Madoff Investments. My name is Janine Langford, and I live in San Rafael, California. As one of the more than 16,000 victims of the Madoff Ponzi scheme, I'm grateful to have the opportunity to present how financially devastating this scandal was to me personally. It shattered my trust in my government's ability to serve and protect us. My hope is that Congress will choose to recognize and protect all indirect investors, such as myself, who were victimized by this scandal. I have worked for 30 years as an art and design professional in the stationery and craft industry. The past 17 years have been as a single parent working to provide for myself and my daughter. In the areas where I have little expertise, I recognize the necessity to hire a specialist. Personal investment was one of those areas, and I knew that there were systems such as the SEC in place to protect me. From my research, there was no reason to believe that this investment was not a viable place to put my life savings. I had no way of knowing the partnership where I placed my money was invested with Madoff. The money I had invested with Madoff represented my life savings. It was my retirement, a down payment for a house, investment for the business I was starting, and it was my daughter's education. In short, it was the foundation for my future. I do not have another 30 years to earn this money again. If the SEC had done its job, I would have my savings, and I would not be looking at working the rest of my life just to get by. I was shocked to find out my money was gone, and I was outraged to find out that the very governing body that sanctioned this business did not protect me. I need help in understanding how the SEC could ignore expert testimony, be lax in its investigations, be influenced by the aura Madoff, and not carry out its duties. I find it tragic and ironic that the interpretation of the language by the SIPC leaves out the indirect, hardworking people like myself who are not wealthy and who are now struggling to keep up because their lifetime of hard-earned savings or their pension has been stolen. These are the very investors for whom the SIPC insurance protection is most important. Congress needs to take action to restore confidence for all future investors. I understand an update to the definition of the word customer in the SIPA to include indirect investors would ensure that the SIPC symbol protects both indirect and direct investors in the financial markets and would begin to restore a sense of trust. If nothing is changed, the current situation would be similar to having a catastrophic landslide and the government came in to assist those on one side of the street but not the other. I cannot believe this is the intent of this committee or of Congress. Though I appreciate extending the SIPC coverage through the Maffei-Ellison Amendment to investors in IRSA plans, this does not go far enough. All of us who invested through family partnerships, trusts, hedge funds, feeder funds, and pension plans are victims of this crime. All of us who invested are also victims of the SEC's inability to find the fraud. We are all victims of the same crime, and we all need to be granted equal protection. The SEC's website reads, "The mission of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission is to protect investors, maintain fair, orderly, and efficient markets, and facilitate capital formation. I urge you to rectify this current disparity of protection by carrying out the mission you set forth." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Langford. I would now like to recognize my colleague from Minnesota to introduce our second witness. Mr. Ellison.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to introduce one of the witnesses, Mr. Joel Green of Upsher-Smith Laboratories, a pharmaceutical company in Minnesota. I've heard from many people in my district and state who were victims of the Madoff scam. Those people weren't high rollers. They were regular people, ordinary people who work hard every day and make America great. People like the ones Mr. Green represents and his colleagues who were part of a pension profit plan that invested with Bernie Madoff. They thought they were protected by the Securities Investment Protection Corporation, SIPC. Unfortunately, SIPC held out itself as the FDIC of the investment world. It hasn't followed through on the protection in many cases. That's why I'm pleased to work with my colleague from New York, Mr. Maffei, on an amendment to clarify SIPC protection should extend to individual participants of pension profit sharing plans. I look forward to continuing to work with you, Mr. Chairman, and others in the committee on this reform and others to ensure that SIPC makes good on its promises. Mr. Green.
Thank you, Congressman Ellison and Mr. McFay and Chairman and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to address your committee. As Congressman Ellison said, my name is Joel Green and I am with Upsher-Smith Laboratories of Minnesota. I'm here to ask for your support for legislation that will protect working people throughout America whose retirement security is imperiled by the Madoff fraud, including current and former employees of Upsher-Smith Laboratories. I urge your support for the legislation prepared by Mr. Ellison and Mr. McFay to extend SIPC protection to cover the losses of individual participants in pension plans, profit-sharing plans, and other qualified